All right, welcome back to Pump and MechPB, and welcome back to part two of our video series doing a deep dive on how snipers and more specifically CCMs function. And in this part of the video series, I want to talk about all of the pneumatic aspects of the pump. And by that, I mean everything that deals with the pressurized air coming from whatever air source that we're using through our ASA here uh, on into the valve and how it shoots the paintball. And I want to focus on how we can set up our pump markers to use that air efficiently and consistently to get the best performance out of the marker possible. And so, like I've talked about in other videos, consistency is important because at range, consistency means accuracy. And if our marker is set up in a way that we're shooting plus or minus 15 feet per second over the chrono, there is no way to adjust for that when you're shooting at long range because it's just too large of a variance for you to adjust shot to shot. You might shoot one ball at somebody and think, oh, I'm a little bit low. And then the next shot comes out, 30 feet per second faster than you expected it to. And then suddenly you're shooting over their bunker. So we want our markers to be consistent as possible to ensure that we're as accurate as possible when we're playing. And when we're playing pump, every shot matters. So having a predictable level of consistency is super important. And so ultimately, to get consistency out of our pump marker, what we want is to fill the valve chamber here with the same pressure of air over and over again. And we want the mechanical side of the marker, like we discussed before, to hit that valve and open it the same amount over and over again so that we get exactly the same amount of air at exactly the same pressure, propelling the paintball out of the barrel every time. That's what gives you consistency. And so as long as the paintballs are decent, which is a real struggle, admittedly, that will give us the consistency that we're looking for, or at least the best consistency that we can get. And so I'll start by talking about sources of debris or gunk and grime that can get into our air system of our pump gun. The first thing here is to say be careful about over lubing. When we're lubing up O-rings, we generally just want to keep them moist and lubricated enough to where they're not sticking, especially the dynamic O-rings. We want them to be lubricated enough so that they're not dragging across whatever surface they're sealing. We don't want to be gooping grease all over every single O-ring in our marker. That will gunk up everything because downstream, because of the way the air flows through the marker, and potentially get in your valve and maybe even into your bolt and down your barrel. That's not good. Just use the appropriate amount of grease. And another source of gunk and debris is Teflon. And so some people like to use this to seal their air fittings, and it does work, and it can be done neatly, but in most cases that I see, people are not applying this properly. And when it gets old, this Teflon sort of disintegrates and it becomes stringy, and you get like long strings of it that can end up in your marker, especially if you're wrapping it too much around the lower threads of your air fitting here. It can get into your marker and it can go downstream and get into your regulator and get into your valve, and that causes issues. And so instead of trying to seal the fittings with Teflon tape, I would highly recommend using either blue Loctite, or there's also a Loctite 545 that's for pneumatic fittings, and that won't create nearly as much of a mess. And so that stuff also can disintegrate over time, but when it does disintegrate, it usually turns into a bit of a powder and not these like long stringy fibers. And so, the powder, if it does get into the airstream of your gun, it will make it through a lot easier than an inch-long piece of Teflon that can gum up your valve. And so I would really just avoid using Teflon tape. There is zero reason to use it. Yeah, so I just want to emphasize that we want clean air coming from our tank. And unfortunately, one source of dirt and debris and maybe even moisture is the air source that you're filling your tank from. And so hopefully you can trust your local field to be maintaining and operating their air compressors properly, but that is one source of issues. If they're not bleeding their compressors of moisture, or if they're not changing their air filters, you can potentially get debris and gunk from your filling source. Hopefully you don't have to deal with that, but it's just something to keep in mind that that is possible. And so moving on from the sources of debris and crap, I want to talk about consistency. And so that really starts with the regulators in your marker setup. And I did say regulators plural because there are two. We have the regulator on the tank here, and we have the regulator on the marker. A lot of people are generally good about keeping the regulator on their marker cleaned and maintained. A lot of people do forget about the regulator on their tank. And so while this does definitely need a lot less maintenance, I would recommend checking it maybe like once a year or something, just to make sure that those O-rings are in good condition and that they're clean, and that the internals of your regulator are working well. You can also, it would be a good idea to hook your tank up to a pressure tester setup. That way you can know the output pressure of your tank, and you can also check the recharge rate of your tank output, and to make sure that this regulator is working well. And so the air coming out of that regulator obviously goes through your ASA and whatever macro line or whatever setup you have, and it makes its way to the regulator here. And so we want to make sure that this regulator is functioning properly. So we want to make sure that it's clean, that it's free of debris, that the O-rings are in good condition and properly lubed. We also want to inspect. So in this style of regulator, there's or other CCM regulators, there will be some sort of plunger that seals against the walls of the inner walls of the regulator. And if you get dirt in between that plunger and those walls of the regulator, over time, that dirt or little abrasive bits of gunk can wear marks into your regulator and cause issues. So it's really good to keep your regulator clean. Another thing that I would like to mention is that with these two regulators, a doubly regulated system is super consistent, or it should be if the regulators are working correctly, because we can, if we do get variations from the output of this regulator, because this regulator is a 50-to-1, meaning that it takes 50 psi change in the input to change 1 psi in the output. So because this regulator on the CCM has such a huge ratio, it really gets rid of the noise, any noise that's coming from the input of this tank regulator. And so it should give you really consistent results, having that doubly regulated system, properly maintained and high quality regulators. So at this point, we can also check the recharge of the HPR on your marker to make sure it's outputting the correct pressure and that it's recharging to that pressure over and over again quickly and consistently. And so that would be a good thing to do. And when you're testing that, you're also testing the recharge of your entire setup. So the tank reg and the HPR at the same time. And that will give you a really good idea of how your marker should be functioning. Another thing to check, in addition to the output pressure setting and the recharge rate, is to leave the pressure on the regulator for a little bit and see if there's any reg creep. And so by that, I mean, take a look at the gauge of your pressure testing setup and see if it moves slightly over time. And you would typically be looking for an increase. If it's decreasing over time, that means you have a leak or something somewhere. That's not typically going to happen. But if it's increasing, that means that you have reg creep, and that's usually an indication that the reg seat is bad and that it's not sealing off properly, and then it's letting higher pressure air through that it shouldn't. And so if that's the case, check your reg seat, rebuild your reg, and hopefully that will get rid of the reg creep. So that's another thing that can lead to inconsistency. If you have a creeping reg, it's not doing the same job over and over again. And so you'll have variable pressure built up in your valve chamber depending on when the last shot was fired. And so we really don't want that. We want the same pressure to be in here no matter what. No matter if we shot our marker 1 second ago or if it's been 20 minutes since we last played, we want the exact same pressure to be in this valve chamber. All right, and so moving on, we get to the valve itself. And so the most important thing for the valve is to check that it's actually sealing. And so the body of the valve has an O-ring has an O-ring right here. And if that's not working, you will get air just pushing past the valve itself, around back through your bottom tube. And then there's another O-ring that acts as a valve seat right here. And if that's not sealing, you'll get air going through the valve actually. And you'll probably hear it as like a slow leak down your barrel. So we want to make sure that the valve is functioning properly, obviously. And we want to make sure that the motion of the valve itself is nice and smooth and that there isn't any friction here. I discussed this in further detail in the first video, so I won't go through that again. And then the last thing is that we want to make sure that this hole is oriented properly, meaning that it is pointed straight up towards the bolt. If this is rotated off to either side, we won't get proper airflow through the valve, and that will cause problems in getting sufficient velocity. So when you're looking at it from the bottom, this little recess should be pointing straight down, and that nut that you screw in from the bottom should go squarely into this hole. And that will make sure that this valve exhaust hole will be pointed straight up towards the bolt so that the air can fly down the barrel and propel the paintball. And while we're on the topic of the bolt, make sure that the bolt is the right way up and that it has the hole for the valve pointed down, or else your paintballs won't go anywhere. And then there's another issue that can pop up, and this isn't as common at all, but sometimes there are issues with bolt length between different brands, and this hole won't line up exactly with the hole that's drilled in the body for the valve exhaust. And so if you're having problems and you have some aftermarket bolt, that could be your issue. Another thing is that the bolt itself, so the match between the outer diameter of the bolt here and the inner diameter of your top tube, if the bolt is really loose, that could cause issues with low velocity, because the air isn't going straight through this hole. It can actually go up and around and maybe even backwards, and it's just not being channeled in the right way. And so a lot of bolts have O-rings around them to prevent that from happening, and the tolerance of and if you have O-rings, the tolerances of the bolt don't matter as much. But for a CCM, since they want a super smooth action in the pump stroke, they don't have O-rings here, and instead they're relying on really high degree of tolerance between this outer diameter and this inner diameter. And so if you're mixing and matching brands of bolts and bodies, you could run into issues like that. But for a stock CCM, that should never be an issue. All right, and so now that we're on the subject of bolt and valve alignment, we want to make sure that an auto trigger, we have everything timed properly. And so the adjustment for that is done by adjusting the lug here to this hole. And there's a hole also drilled in the bolt, so that you can drop a 1/8 Allen key all the way through. And typically you would just nudge the bolt backward, or you would nudge the hammer backwards just a little bit to get that Allen key to fall in. But to make this adjustment, essentially you just hold the trigger down and you cock the gun, and you very slowly bring the pump handle forward, and you would want to see it fire about right there. 1/8 inch gap max, I would say. You could go a little bit closer if you want, but that's timed about right, as you see there, something like that. And so that will ensure that when you're auto triggering, the timing of when the hammer opens the valve and when the bolt actually closes is synced up, and so you're getting a nice burst of air coming through the valve when the bolt is where it needs to be. If you're not using the auto trigger, the timing doesn't really matter at all, as long as you're holding the bolt closed when you shoot the gun. The timing is definitely something to consider when you're auto triggering. And so if it's firing too early, so if you're firing here, you would need to lower the lug, and if it's firing too late, you would need to raise the lug. And so it's really just as simple as that. Just making little, quarter turn at a time adjustments, maybe even smaller, to this lug, and you'll get it right after a little bit of trial and error. One other thing to mention about Timing is that if you have a really old trigger, I mentioned this in the last video, but if you have a really old trigger that's worn at this part where it contacts the auto trigger cam, you can get an inconsistent timing because this cam is rotating on a worn groove in the trigger, and so that can cause issues in the timing, which will result in issues in consistency. So that's just something to check. If you're having problems, just take a look at that trigger and make sure there's not a huge divot worn in the top where it contacts the auto trigger cam. Okay, and so we've covered almost everything about the marker that can lead to consistency issues or things that we need to make sure are correct to get good consistency. So lastly, we want to make sure that we are buying high quality paint. So don't cheap out on paint when you're playing Pump. I'd recommend getting the freshest, highest quality paint you can get. You want to make sure that it's appropriately bore sized so that we're not getting rollouts. Especially with today's paint, I would not recommend underboring by a lot because the paint is unfortunately inconsistent from ball to ball, and it also can be out of round. And so if you get a ball dropping in with its fat side facing your bore, you could get a barrel break very easily doing that. Even though in the other orientation the ball might roll out. I mean, in that case, playing Pump isn't very much fun, but I would go with the smallest bore that you can use that isn't breaking a lot of paint in that case. But you also want to be aware of rollouts because they're not fun either. Usually I can find at least one sizer in my kit that does a decent job of avoiding barrel breaks and rollouts, but it can be a little bit tough sometimes depending on the quality of paint that's available to you. And so the last tip that I would give for getting good consistency out of your CCM is to make sure that your hopper is clean. And so typically I clean my hopper after every day of play because it's surprising how much grease and gunk and debris can build up inside of your hopper after having several hundred paintballs through it. So yeah, just give it a nice clean with a microfiber cloth, and while you're at it, clean your pods too. I usually clean them after every use. That might be a little bit excessive, but the paint that I've been getting lately has been very oily, so I like to make sure that all my pods and my hopper are very clean. It also might be worth it to invest in a microfiber bag to clean your paint before you pot it up. I've been doing that a lot lately and been finding good results out of that. So I think that just about does it on all the things I wanted to mention about consistency and the pneumatic and air pressure related parts of the pump. And so hopefully if you followed all of the tips that I gave in my first video about the mechanical side of the pump, and if you did the same for this one, your pump should be super smooth, and with good paint you should be getting plus or minus 2 or 3 feet per second over the chrono. So yeah, hopefully you found some of this information helpful, and the next time you go out and play with your pump, you have a nice time, and you can shoot lanes with your auto trigger, and you're getting ball-on-ball accuracy. But yeah, more pump videos to come. Thanks for watching.